Bismillah. Surah Al-Kahf, the chapter of the cave, is the 18th chapter of the Holy Quran. This particular chapter is significant to Muslims for a number of reasons. In this particular chapter, we find 4 stories that are highlighted in this particular chapter. And in some ways, when we look at this particular story, we can it makes us think that the main aim is to provide sort of paradigms for the spiritual paths, in that these particular stories, when you look and reflect deeply upon them, you find that they highlight the 4 cardinal virtues which the ancient people actually believed in and emphasized. Those particular virtues are the virtues of courage, followed by the virtue of patience, and then we find in the story of Moses, the story which emphasizes the importance of prudence or practical wisdom, and then finally it ends with the story about justice. Now each story has its own protagonist, it has its own setting as well. So for instance, in the story of the Companions of the Cave, which is the basis for the title, the name of this chapter, we find that the protagonists in this particular story are a bunch of teenagers who are believers in God. In the second story, we find the protagonist is a poor man. In the story of the garden, a poor man who is a believer in God. And then in the third story, it is actually the one who's come to teach Moses, who is looked upon as a protagonist. And then finally, we find a king known as Dhul Qarnayn in the fourth story, who happens to be the protagonist there. Now, the settings that you find in each particular story are significant too, in that you can see a sort of spiritual connection between those particular settings. So for instance, in the first story, we have the setting of an actual cave, and the cave is dark and it's cold, but actually it's a home as well for the youth. It is a place of refuge for them. You know, and then when the story of the garden, you have this big field of grapes and date palms and rivers as well. You know, that is the setting there. So you see sort of expansion happening, you know, from a cave into a field. And then finally, when we come to the third story, the story of Moses, we find that the setting is the place where the 2 seas meet. Or so in the story, Moses he's on the sea and he's fishing and so this itself shows some type of growth. And then when we see in the last story, the setting is the entire world itself. So the first story actually begins in the cave, but realistically, when we look at the protagonist or the antagonist in the story is a tyrannical king. But at the end of the surah, we end up finding a just king who actually has rule or dominion over the world. So it begins with dominion and it ends with dominion, but for the dominion given in the first case is of a tyrannical person, but in the final story is the discussion of a just ruler and what that looks like. So in that sense, the surah is trying to provide for us these 4 paradigms: the paradigm of courage, the paradigm of patience, the paradigm of practical wisdom, and then finally the paradigm of justice. Now, the surah itself is mentioned is the 18th chapter of the Quran. And that being the case, the title is taken from the fact that the word kahf or cave is mentioned in the surah, and it happens to be the only place in the actual entire Quran where this particular word is mentioned. It's mentioned 6 times in this particular chapter, the surah itself was revealed during the Meccan period. That's significant in that when we look at the history of Islam, that we find that the history of the prophetic era is divided into the Meccan and the Medinan period. So this surah was revealed during the Meccan period when the Muslims were highly oppressed. They themselves didn't have their own home. And so it was revealed during this particular time, and it said that the context of the revelation was that the Meccans, they consulted the Jews of Medina about the Prophet himself, and they wanted to try to find a way to undermine the Prophet's message. And so they consulted with the Jews who they knew had some knowledge of the previous revelation. It is the revelation similar to what the Prophet Muhammad himself had claimed to be representing. So the Jews sent back with them 3 questions that they wanted them to ask the Prophet. One of those questions related to the story of the sleepers, which is what this particular story we're going to deal with today is about. And then another question they asked him about is, ask him to tell us about the soul. What is the soul? And then the third question was about this man called the possessor of the two horns, Dhul Qarnayn, who was mentioned toward the end of this chapter. So who is this person and what do you know about him? And so they said, well, if he gives the proper answer, then he's a true prophet. If he doesn't, then he's not a true prophet. So they posed these questions to him. And so the Quran was revealed regarding this particular story. Now, the story, the way it goes is that this is under or believed to be during the Roman Empire. And according to the Christian or Judeo-Christian version of this story, that this particular incident happened in the town known as Ephesus, which was part of the Roman Empire and located somewhere in modern-day Turkey today. The Roman Empire was an idolatrous culture, pagan culture. They persecuted non-pagans, and in particular, since the Christians did not worship idols, for us, they would be early Muslims, not just Christians, but they would have been Muslims, according to the way that we understand Islam as a trans-historical religion. But they were people who surrendered themselves to God. So according to this particular story, the Christians, or the followers of Jesus Christ during this time, they were being persecuted because they refused to worship the idols. And they were threatened with death, stoning, among other things. These young men, they took flight from the city and they took refuge in the cave. And they themselves did so because they refused to surrender their beliefs in God and their belief that the idol worship was not appropriate. So they go to the cave and they settle there and they worship God. Along with them is a dog, as mentioned in the Quran. What happens is sleep overcomes them, and over 3 centuries pass by while they're there, and then they wake up. When they wake up, they are not completely certain how much time they were asleep. They wake up and start to ask one another, how long we've been asleep, and they start to make guesses. But then eventually they say, well, it really doesn't matter. But they know they're hungry. So what one of them is chosen to go to the market. He said, go to the marketplace, go buy us some of the best and most wholesome food that's around, and take this silver with you as well. So he goes down and his clothing, his attire from 3 centuries ago, his coins, his silver coins from 3 centuries ago, goes down to the marketplace, attempts to buy something. People notice it and realize there's something very strange about this individual. And of course, they were fearful as well because they were being persecuted, that they were going to be forced back into their religion. So they tried to conceal this fact, but once he utilized the money, it became very apparent that these people are not from around here. So this became a major issue. People started to congregate around him. Eventually, he makes his way back to the cave and informs the others. And according to tradition, we were taught that very shortly after this, all of them died. All of them died, and the people who had heard of this story, they visited the cave and they decided that they would make this particular cave into some form of monument. Some of them were saying, well, we'll make it into a place of worship as well. So some of them were just overcome by amazement about the story that is what they wanted to do. So this is what the Quran tells us about this story, but the ultimate aim was to clarify that the Prophet Muhammad was telling the truth to the pagans of Mecca and to the Jews of Medina, and that he had some knowledge of this. And with regard to the number of the sleepers, this is something that the Jews and the Christians had debated about over years. And so the Quran sort of talks about this. Some of them say 3 and the dog with the 4th of them. Some say there were 5 and the dog with the 6th, and then some say 7 and the dog is the 8th of them. And they said, but say, our Lord, my Lord knows best what their number was. مَا يَعْلَمُهُ إِلَّا قَلِيلٌ. Only a few people really truly know. And that is to say that this is really not the important part, or an important lesson to be taken from this story, is that how many they were and the fact that actually they themselves came from that particular time, but rather that this is a sign for them that the resurrection is true. that God's promise is true. And so they should believe and take from the example of these particular youths, these young people. It proves to us and shows us that you don't have to be old in order to be righteous. That's one of the things that you learn from this as well, in addition to the fact that it teaches us of God's enormous power. The Quran says that they had spent 309 years asleep. And some say that is a reference to lunar years, which would actually come out to be about exactly almost exactly 300 solar years. At any rate, those details are mentioned in the story. But the ultimate aim, I would say, to learn from this story, the ultimate lesson to be learned from this story is the importance of courage when it pertains to matters of morality, matters that pertain to our religious beliefs. We should not compromise on very important aspects of our religion. And so this particular aspect of religion was the belief in the oneness of God in particular. And so these young people who you would expect to be somewhat defenseless against the adults in the society, and it would not necessarily be courageous and would not be defiant. They decided to show their defiance, and they rejected the beliefs of these people, and they take refuge in the cave. And God, he saved them, he spared them, and he produced a miracle as a result of that particular struggle that they had. So hopefully that particular amount of information will provide you with some insight with regard to this particular chapter of the Quran, and hopefully it will be of benefit to you and also of a source of increase in every good thing. And we say to you, Assalamu alaikum.